Wednesday at 8 on WTTW.
What do you think of when you hear the phrase classical music?
Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, I wonder why, though.
So maybe it's less about needing to define what classical sounds are and listening out for what sounds classical.
Ooh, I see what you did there.
When it comes to family, I always do what's best. My parents taught me that. That's why I called A Place for Mom. Their personalized guidance was what I needed to find senior living for Mom. And their advices to families gave us options based on our needs and budget, guiding us to the decision. I never expected a service to make such a difference.
Our service to your family, today.
WTTW programming originates from the Renee Crown Public Media Center.
Hi, I'm Rick Steves. Join me this holiday season for a colorful musical celebration of Christmas all across Europe. We'll explore festive markets, enjoy glorious local choirs, toast tasty holiday traditions with family and friends, and find some time to play in the snow. Along the way, we'll have some fun in the studio, sharing the latest tips about traveling smartly. It's my 2-hour holiday special, European Christmas.
Friday at 8 on WTTW.
Hey, I'm Ivan Villava and you're watching WTTW.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Paris Schutz has the evening off. On the show tonight,
there's a domino effect when CTA is not at its best.
Transit service is suffering because of a huge staffing shortfall. How the CTA is trying to close the gap.
This is a case that should be decided by the Supreme Court 9-0. This is a fringe theory.
We preview a controversial election law case before the Supreme Court. And Chicago's Grammy Award-winning ensemble Third Coast Percussion explores the many possibilities of percussion. First, some of today's top stories. Chicago voters now know which candidate for mayor will have the top spot on the ballot for February's municipal election. The Chicago Board of Elections held that lottery today. Only candidates who were in line at 9 a.m. to submit their nominating petitions on the first day of filing were eligible for the first place lottery, an advantageous slot according to some political minds. Community activist Jamal Green will be #1 on the ballot for mayor. The 27-year-old is facing a ballot challenge, though, from fellow candidate businessman Willie Wilson. Wilson's campaign representative Ricky Hendon told reporters why he's challenging Green's petitions. A few other candidates reacted to the lottery this morning as well.
I have a page of Jamal Green that not one signature is good on the entire page.
I think people are going to find the person who they resonate with, right, no matter where they are on the ballot. But it's helpful to be at the top, I believe, and we'll see, how that all plays out.
It's nice to be in the lottery. Be nice to be in the #1 position. But I think, the voters aren't concerned about what number of people are on the lottery. The voters are concerned about safety.
And for the rest of the ballot order, visit our website at WTTW.com/news. Governor J.B. Pritzker signs the amendment to the much-debated Safety Act passed by state lawmakers just last week. The amendment includes clarifying court authority in controlling electronic monitoring and escape, outlining specific guidelines for trespassing violations, and creating a grant program to help public defenders with increased caseloads. Supporters also say the amendment ensures that individuals who pose a risk to public safety are not released simply because they can afford to pay bail, while people who are not a safety risk or a safety threat sit in jail because they cannot afford to pay bail. It's a key principle of the act. Two brothers are facing federal charges for brazen armed robbery on Halloween morning. Federal prosecutors say 21-year-old Corey Singleton, seen here, and 18-year-old Daryl Singleton got away with more than $1 million when they pointed guns at an armored truck driver as he attempted to refill an ATM. It happened at a Chase Bank branch in Lansing, just next to South Holland, where the two men are both from. The older brother was taken into custody after attempting to flee the scene by car. Police are still searching for the younger Singleton, seen here. A third suspect, a juvenile, has been arrested and charged in state court. Up next, how the CTA is trying to close a big staffing shortfall. We'll explain right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Yesterday, we told you about the long hours some CTA bus and train operators are paid for, the potential safety risks that come with working lengthy shifts, and the effects on the CTA's budget. As the Chicago Transit Authority tries to fix its years-long problem with short staffing, it's touted an aggressive new hiring program and incentives to get new workers on board and boost lagging service. Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg has been investigating the problem and joins us now. Nick.
Brandis, hiring bonuses, retention bonuses, and a raise for new CTA employees. Those are all part of the CTA's plan to attract and keep bus and train operators and mechanics as the agency claws its way out of a huge staffing shortfall. The CTA just announced all new bus operators and mechanics will get a $1,000 hiring bonus and be eligible for retention bonuses through the end of next year. Starting rates for new hires are also on the rise, but with hundreds of positions still vacant and big gaps in bus and train service, many CTA riders are venting their frustrations.
It seemed like an hour to me that we waited for the darn Stony Island bus to come, and I was very heated about that.
On a recent Wednesday, Denise Simmons was tired of CTA delays. Her complaints have been echoed by passengers around the city and by members of the city council.
Our constituents depend on CTA like their life depends on it. There's a domino effect when CTA is not at its best.
At a recent city council hearing, CTA President Dorval Carter laid out in stark terms just how short-staffed the agency is.
We've had a lot of employees leave CTA. That mass resignation really started at the beginning of this year. We are having a difficult time hiring new operators.
Right now, the CTA has 100 to 200 openings for train operators and 600 to 700 openings for bus drivers. The agency's been holding job fairs all year, trying to draw applicants.
I have never experienced anything like the ever-evolving and unprecedented challenges that I'm dealing with today.
The agency's also partnered with Olive Harvey College to help potential new hires get their commercial learner's permit and driver's license. And they've done away with the requirement that bus operators first start as part-timers, instead allowing recruits to start work full-time. Keith Hill leads the union representing drivers.
When I came in 1998, I came in part-time. Part-time to me was a rough part of my life. We're working on a full-time workforce right now, and I think that'll better suit the average worker.
Since 2015, that workforce has lost hundreds of bus and rail operators. Hill says the CTA can go further in changing its hiring practices. For example, relaxing rules on people whose commercial licenses were suspended for things other than a moving violation, like missing child support payments, or creating an apprenticeship program for bus cleaners.
Because everybody's not college material. When you get to the age of 21, then maybe see if they want to drive a bus. That'll bring more people and keep the pot growing.
Hill isn't just worried about how to bring in more drivers. He's also worried about what people who stick with the job face right now.
They don't know if that person been waiting 20 minutes or 30 minutes. When you see your bus driver, don't attack them. We just here to simply do a job.
Because driving a bus can be such a tough job, transit leaders say current employees and potential applicants are looking elsewhere. Jobs like delivering packages for UPS or FedEx also require a commercial driver's license, but don't require drivers to interact with passengers.
And those jobs offer, competitive wage rates and benefits equal to what transit does, in many cases perhaps sometimes better. without the rigidity.
Paul Skoutelis leads the American Public Transportation Association. That group surveyed transit agencies around the country. 96% said they're experiencing a serious workforce shortage.
Of those, 84% indicated that the shortage is affecting their ability to provide daily service. It hampers both their reliability of service and also hampers them in their climb back to claiming ridership gains again.
That shortage isn't just driven by people lured to other transportation jobs.
Agencies are reporting retirees are making up about 24% of all workers who are moving on.
And replacing those workers isn't always simple.
There's surely been a decline in job quality over the years.
Chris Van Eycken with the nonprofit group Transit Center dug into that issue in a report called Bus Operators in Crisis. Among the reasons people are leaving or avoiding the job, increased cost of living, tensions between workers and management, the increase in assaults on drivers, and
younger operators get the worst routes to drive at the worst times, and they have the hardest jobs to do despite having the least experience and being the least prepared to deal with difficult situations.
Van Eycken says it'll take a holistic approach to attract and retain drivers. Everything from making workers part of the decision-making process to providing better facilities for drivers to connecting workers with childcare and other services.
I think ensuring that folks can live fuller lives while becoming a bus operator is a huge factor here.
These are the workers that have been on the front lines of the pandemic, and I'm sure workers are feeling very stretched and under stress.
Susan Hurley of Chicago Jobs with Justice says it's important the CTA hire the staff it needs to reduce the strain on current workers and provide the service passengers rely on. Her group's working to organize CTA riders to advocate for the best service possible.
Our priorities are accessibility, equity, affordability, safety, and reliability. It's become clear that the #1 priority right now needs to be hiring more workers.
As the CTA works to do just that, it's also making adjustments to its schedules to reflect the service it says it can actually provide.
All that sounds to me like service cuts and longer waits, which I hope not, because if that's the case, then it's the repercussion is going to come on my driver.
I am not doing service cuts. There is nothing in my budget, there is nothing in my plans that suggests anything around cutting service. In fact, I'm looking at ways that I can extend and enhance service.
But part of the reason the CTA can run buses and trains at its current service level is because of federal stimulus funding. That money's being used to make up for lost fare revenue, since ridership isn't back to pre-pandemic levels. If the agency can't hire staff, improve service, and lure back riders before the money runs out in 2025,
at that point, do we want to raise fares because that's just going to drive down ridership further? And we've seen this before in the CTA. The CTA has had previous budget crises. The trains used to run, a lot of them, the lines were 24 hours. Now that's no longer the case. Could we see more of that in the future? We certainly have with other transit agencies.
The CTA says as of last month, it's hired 390 bus operators this year with a goal of 450 by year's end. And Brandis, the agency just held another career fair this past Friday.
A lot of work ahead for CTA. Nick, thank you. Great reporting.
Certainly is. Thank you.
And if you missed Nick's story yesterday on spikes in CTA overtime, you can catch it on our website, WTTW.com/news. Up next, details on a controversial election law case. But first, a look at the weather.
Culture is vibrant, it's rich, it's fun.
We try to focus on, hey, let me help you. This is what Chicago is. This is Little Village.
Some legal observers are calling it the most important election law case in decades, and it's set to go before the U.S. Supreme Court tomorrow. The case is Moore v. Harper and centers on the so-called independent state legislature theory. At issue is whether North Carolina's Supreme Court has the right under the state constitution to invalidate gerrymandered maps drawn by the legislature. Here's what former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder told us about the case in October.
The independent state legislature theory works under this notion that somehow legislatures can operate independently of courts in states, independently of governors in states when it comes to drawing drawing district lines with regard to gerrymandering. It's inconsistent with our notion of checks and balances. This is a case that should be decided by the Supreme Court 9-0. This is a fringe theory. It's a fringe case.
So joining us now with more are Carolyn Shapiro, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Illinois Tech Chicago-Kent College of Law, where she's the co-director of the Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States, and Joseph Morris, a partner at the law firm Morris & De La Rosa. He is also chairman of the board of the Heartland Institute, a free market think tank. And for transparency, we should note that Mr. Morris is also the chair of WTTW's Community Advisory Board. Welcome back to the studio, both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So we just heard former Attorney General Eric Holder call the independent state legislature theory a fringe theory, but it is not just Democrats and liberals who think it's a bad idea. Some conservatives have also come out against the theory. Stephen Calabrese, founder of the Federalist Society, warning that if put into practice, it would, quote, flout core tenets of the American founding. Joe Morris, to you first, fringe theory or a valid legal argument?
It's not a fringe theory. It's a valid legal argument. I disagree with it in the way it's primarily framed. The question is, what does the Constitution mean when it says in Article 1 that the responsibility for making up the election rules for federal elections is assigned to the legislature in each state? Now, I suppose a highly mechanical way of looking at that is to say, well, it means some chamber or pair of chambers in a bicameral in a state with a bicameral legislature. What I think the best reading of the Constitution is it means whatever is the lawmaking process set up by the Constitution of that state. The federal Constitution was not intended to supplant or denigrate or minimize the role of state constitutions, and it's state constitutions that set up the lawmaking process of each state. What the federal Constitution is saying is whatever the state constitution's process for making election laws is to be within the state, that's the part of the state government that's responsible for deciding how to conduct federal elections in the state. The point being, I think, from the beginning, that federal elections and state elections and local elections ought to be held under the same general ground rules and preferably at the same time.
Carolyn Shapiro, you filed an amicus brief with the court. What compelled you to want to do that, and what are your concerns about this theory?
Well, I was interested in this theory since the 2020 election, when it actually emerged as a potentially decisive theory after the Pennsylvania Supreme Court held that the absentee ballots had to be accepted if for constitutional reasons, for reasons based on that state's constitution. They held that the received by date had to be extended. So I became interested in the theory then. I ended up writing a law review article about it. But one of the things that concerns me enormously about it follows on something that Joe just said. The idea that state elections and federal elections should basically be held at the same time under the same general principles, which is how it's pretty much always been. But the ISLT, the independent state legislature theory, would create a situation where if a state court said, well, this law is unconstitutional under our state constitution, it would still have to apply to federal elections. We'd end up with this very bizarre dual system. It would be chaotic and confusing, and it's completely unlike anything we've ever had.
Joe Morris, what do you make of the arguments that some people fear that if the Supreme Court should side with North Carolina or the North Carolina state legislature, that it would be dangerous to democracy?
I don't see a peril to democracy. I do see a peril to federalism. I see a danger of creeping control by the federal government of all elections. That's not something from the beginning we've wanted, and I don't think it's something that we want now. We want the states to be in charge of how elections are governed. The question is, what's the role of the state courts in this process? The federal Constitution says the legislature of the state is responsible for making these decisions. In my mind, and I think the prevailing view of what the Constitution means is that means that whatever the state constitution sets up as the lawmaking process, in most states, it means two chambers and a legislation that's presented to a governor with an opportunity for a veto. Now, we have at least one state today that is only one unicameral legislature, Nebraska. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution, by the way, the federal Constitution, there was more than one state that had a unicameral legislature, and there were some states that didn't have a veto process or a role by the governor in lawmaking at all. It varied from state to state by virtue of the state's constitution. The federal Constitution respects state constitutions. The question is, what's the role of the state courts after the legislature acts? If the state courts say the legislature violated the state constitution in some procedural way or in some substantive way, what happens next? The problem we're getting into here is the question of whether or not the state courts get to rewrite, in effect, write new legislation off the tops of their heads, or is their job to send it back to the legislature and say, do it the right way? I think the better wisdom is the latter. If the state court should not rewrite law, it should send it back to the legislature that's responsible for generating a law to correct whatever errors the state court points out have been made.
And you're saying the intent of the law, the intent of the theory is so that the legislative process is to make the decision versus the legislators themselves making, for example, throwing out the results of an election if they wanted to.
The legislative process as opposed to the executive process or as opposed to the judicial process. Whatever the state constitution sets up as the lawmaking process for that state, under the constitution of the state, by the way, in some states the process could be delegated to an independent commission. That could be made by the constitution of that state, the lawmaking body for purposes of establishing election rules. That's what the federal constitution is trying to bootstrap.
So I'll just jump in and say I agree with much of what Joe said. I do disagree that state courts shouldn't be able to issue orders that change the law under certain circumstances. State courts have equitable power. All courts have equitable powers. And this doesn't apply simply to, say, redistricting, which is what's at issue in the North Carolina case, but, say, decisions that have to be made under extreme time pressure. And there might not necessarily be time to send things back to the legislature. And again, we could end up with the same problem of dual systems.
Carolyn, what is the legal precedent regarding ISLT? Has the Supreme Court weighed in on this issue before?
The precedent is overwhelmingly, to the extent it exists, and there's not much, is overwhelmingly against the ISLT. There are a couple of cases from the early 20th century that do exactly what Joe describes. They say that it's the lawmaking process, and if that means there's a gubernatorial veto, that means there's a gubernatorial veto. If that means there's a referendum and the people can reject what the legislature did, that's what it means. In 2015, the Supreme Court upheld an independent redistricting commission created by the people of the state of Arizona through the initiative process. So and in 2019, the Supreme Court, in rejecting federal ability for courts to look at partisan gerrymandering, pointed to those kinds of amendments and said it's okay if the federal courts don't do it because there are ways the state constitutions can address this problem.
Couple of seconds left. Oral arguments tomorrow. Supreme Court not expected to rule until probably June. Any sense as to which way the justices might be leaning on this case? About 10 seconds.
There are some justices who wrote in 2020 that in support of the ISLT, but since then, there's been an enormous amount of historical research that's come out that demonstrates that from any historical perspective, originalist, long-standing practice, there's really no basis for it. So I hope they'll take a second look at the history.
Joe?
There are obviously 4 justices who wanted to hear the case. Why they wanted to hear the case, we don't know. I would not be surprised if this were a 6-3 decision. I would not be surprised if it were a 9-0 decision.
Everybody's got to wait and see. Joe Morris and Carolyn Shapiro, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And up next, we introduce you to Chicago's Grammy Award-winning ensemble, Third Coast Percussion. Chicago is home to a Grammy-winning quartet of classically trained percussionists who can make music out of anything. And whether they're playing marimbas and cowbells or toys and toothbrushes, they drum up a lot of attention. They're called Third Coast Percussion, and they've now been nominated for a Grammy for the 4th year in a row. Producer Mark Vitale has the story.
We're based here in Chicago. We play lots of shows here. We also tour all across the country and across the world. And we write some of our own music, and we have lots of great music written for us by some of the greatest people who are writing music today.
That includes Philip Glass, Missy Mazzoli, and this work from the film composer Danny Elfman.
We try and be what you would expect from a percussion ensemble, and plenty of things that you could never have expected from a percussion ensemble.
One new work has them making music from a table full of toys and everyday items.
And that's one of the great things about percussion. Any object in the entire world can be a percussion instrument if it makes a sound and you like it. We explore all those possibilities.
They met while studying at Northwestern University, and they make their recordings in town for the Chicago-based label Sadie Records.
Chicago is our home, and it's our artistic home in that we feel like it has nurtured us and helped us become the group that we are. This is a full-time job, and the four of us have been making music together for over 17 years. So there's a freedom that comes with that.
Who plays what is not really an issue when any ensemble member can play anything.
Because each of our pieces calls for completely different instrumentation. We'll look at the piece and either say, oh, I want to play that part on this piece, or I want to play that part. Or what happens more often is we just divide the parts up alphabetically by our last name. The most common misconception about percussion ensembles is that it's going to be a bunch of drummers playing on drums nonstop for an hour and a half. And we do that, and we love that. Melody is also a hugely important part of what we do, melody and harmony. The cool thing about once you've opened your ears up is that any sound anywhere that's interesting to you is important. And we hope that some people come to our concerts and leave listening to the world a little bit differently.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
Tomorrow night, Third Coast Percussion performs at Gannon Concert Hall on the campus of DePaul University. They'll perform 3 world premieres, including that work with toys and everyday objects. Their most recent album, Perspectives, is up for 2 Grammys in the categories Best Chamber Music by a Small Ensemble and Best Engineered Classical Recording. The Grammy Awards are February 5th. You can find out more about Third Coast Percussion on our website. We're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night, abbreviated to bring you special pledge programming. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Candidates look to remove others from the ballot in February's municipal election. Our Spotlight Politics team digs into what it means for the race for mayor. And we visit a boxing club for kids inside a little village church. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.
Enslaved people like Harriet Tubman were the original abolitionists.
She was very to the point. My name is Harriet Tubman. I'm here to take you to freedom. You need to follow me, and we need to move right now.
She is someone who saw herself as having a purpose and who was on earth to deliver on that purpose.
Harriet Tubman, Visions of Freedom.
Next on WTTW.
Frederick Douglass was born into slavery.
I was a graduate from this peculiar institution with my diploma written on my back.
How did he escape